on the Right to Try Act. But first, I want to discuss the factors influencing policy development and implementation in the clinical setting. Cost should always be considered when developing or changing a policy. Questions should be addressed such as, are the funds available? How can they be made available? Is the change going to be worth the cost? Another important factor that should be addressed in policymaking and implementation is identifying who will be affected by the policy and ensuring that its implementation will be fair to all populations involved. Also, stakeholder involvement is an important aspect of policymaking to ensure that their interests are being met and also that they will be proactive in implementing the policy. These stakeholders or individuals directly involved in the implementation of the policy may be able to also offer information already known about solutions that have or have not worked in the past, as well as possible resources available to ensure implementation will be successful. It is important to ask how this policy can encompass the concerns of all the stakeholders. It is also important to consider whether the policy is ethical by carefully weighing the legality and mortality. Which policy will do the most good and the least harm? Today, we are going to discuss the 115th Congress First Session Right to Try Act of 2017. This act authorizes terminally ill patients to use medications that are not yet approved for use in the public. The problem statement is, does the removal of the FDA approval of experimental drugs being administered to terminally ill patients improve the process for these individuals or pose an increased overall risk? A little background to this policy is that right now there is a right to try law in place in 38 states, including North Carolina. These terminally ill patients have access to clinical trial drugs. However, until the Right to Try Act becomes a federal bill approved by the Senate, residents in the remaining states will not have this access. The previous steps involved for these terminally ill patients to obtain experimental drug treatments included the following: agreement from a licensed doctor to implement the therapy, agreement from a drug company to utilize the therapy, clearance from the FDA to initiate the therapy, institutional board approval for the implementation of the therapy, and patient consent as well as financial responsibility for the treatment. However, pharmaceutical companies often waive payments for these trial medications. Although terminally ill patients have had access to these experimental drug treatments in the past, this act specifically eliminates the step involving FDA clearance. However, according to Huerger 2016, the FDA has approved 99.5% of the requests in the past and has played only a minor role in the approval of experimental therapies. Therefore, their removal from this process is minimally useful aside from additional paperwork and time involved. In addition, these patients are offered clinical trial drugs with the exception of being involved with clinical trials. This could potentially weaken clinical research by limiting data collection. In the future, this could be detrimental to public health, as clinical trials are crucial in the development of new treatments. Although these patients are not included in clinical trials, they are still monitored by researchers for adverse effects. This can further compromise the time of these researchers without any resulting benefit. Elimination of the FDA approval could also lead to negative financial incentives for pharmaceutical companies to target these populations without the oversight of the FDA. The analysis is necessary to avoid potential risks involved with the elimination of the FDA approval in a terminally ill patient's ability to obtain experimental drugs. Key stakeholders include the terminally ill patients, physicians, pharmaceutical companies, the IRB, as well as the FDA. Both Republicans and Democrats supported the bill. However, physicians and drug companies claim that it is not in the best interest of the public and are opposing it. These physicians, as well as the drug industry, are showing interest in changing this policy due to the risk involved with inhibiting clinical research, as well as the risk to patient safety despite the terminal illness. There is also discussion about the effects of using clinical trial drugs in end of life as opposed to the use of palliative care. It is important to act now in order to prevent inhibition of clinical research, as well as prevent any undue patient harm due to lack of FDA involvement. Quality of care is an important factor to address. It is thought that by enabling this act, we will be promoting quality of care for terminally ill patients that are seeking any efforts to survive. However, this law is ethically questionable because it is rare that these therapies are actually effective, and often implementing these therapies can just cause further harm. It is important for these patients to understand the benefits of palliative care and end-of-life comfort, as well as have realistic expectations of clinical trial drugs. The use of these clinical trial drugs for terminally ill patients poses many fairness issues. Frequently, when drug companies develop a new drug for clinical trial, there is only a limited amount of it. This limited stock is used primarily in the clinical trials to try and advance the medication to its eventual release to the public. However, by releasing these drugs early to patients that may not even be candidates for the treatment can hugely affect the advancement of the drug trial. This can delay the process and inhibit the public from eventual use of that drug. Drug companies often do not charge patients for trial drugs, causing financial burden on the development of the drug as well. On occasion, the patient is required to pay out of pocket for the medication, which may actually cause them more harm than good. Lack of FDA involvement leaves physicians very little information about the clinical drug trial, including dosing and side effects. It also gives drug companies the ability to market unregulated experimental medications to patients. This can lead to legal concerns in the future. The following three options to change the Right to Try Act ensure patient safety and quality of care, as well as cost effectiveness and maximizes public benefit. Option 1 to change this act involves allowance of these terminally ill patients to become involved in the clinical trial process. This would benefit the patient and the public by providing feedback from the treatment on effectiveness, adverse effects, etc. This would also eliminate risks of experimental drug release directly to patients by allowing the FDA to stay involved. Negative aspects of this change include potentially skewed data from clinical trials because of the patient's terminal illness and them potentially not being a candidate for the trial. Additionally, this change would increase cost for the drug company to be administering medication to individuals that may not meet the exact criteria for their study. Option 2 would be to create a fast-track method of processing patient requests for FDA approval. This modification would not benefit the drug trial process. However, it would protect the patient by making the FDA involved once again, as well as eliminating the current time-consuming process of obtaining approval. This would be a low-cost solution. The forms involved in requesting approval have been shortened in the past, but could once again be shortened and made easier to complete. Additionally, the FDA can be given time parameters by which they would have to complete the requests. This would increase efficiency of the process, as well as improve quality of care by eliminating the time-consuming aspect of the process. It would also improve patient safety and provide doctors with crucial information about the trial drugs before administration by allowing the FDA to stay involved. Option 3 would be requiring the drugs in the patient access would only be allowed for drugs in phase 3 trials. In addition, insurance could offer an end-of-life coverage that patients can decide to use for either palliative intervention or clinical trial drugs. Although the FDA oversight would be bypassed, this would ensure that safety and efficacy of the drug was known due to it being in phase 3, as well as potential adverse effects. This would prevent drug companies from releasing a plethora of ineffective phase 1 drugs to individuals that could be potentially fatal. A negative aspect of this choice would be the inability of the FDA to be involved and provide crucial information to the implementing physician about dosing and side effects, as well as any other pertinent drug information. Another negative aspect would be the limitation of patients to available phase 3 drugs. The end-of-life coverage would prevent financial burden on the patient and prevent pharmaceutical companies from stalling the advancement of a drug due to monetary reasons. I recommend option 3. This would very subtly change the already approved policy by just adding an additional parameter that the trial drug must at least be in phase 3 testing, ensuring safety and efficacy. This would still eliminate involvement of the FDA, whose approval process commonly deters physicians from applying, despite being revised and shortened in the past. Including patients with terminal illnesses in clinical trials could result in potentially skewed data. This change would not involve these patients in clinical trials. Another recommendation for this process would be palliative care awareness. In addition to confirming the patient's terminal diagnosis, physicians involved with the process should also document proper education of palliative intervention and its benefits, offering this alternative to these individuals first. It is important that knowledge and understanding of palliative care as an alternative is clear to the patient as they are making a decision to start a trial drug. Making phase 3 trial drugs available to these patients could pose a financial strain on pharmaceutical companies, as well as patients. Insurance companies should include an end-of-life coverage that either pays for palliative involvement or provides coverage for the phase 3 trial drugs. Either route the patient decides to take as an end-of-life decision, they would be provided, in this case, with financial support, preventing financial strain on the pharmaceutical company as well as the patient. In evaluating this policy change, it is important to reassess the criteria included in the initial analysis. These criteria included were patient safety, quality of care, cost effectiveness, and public benefit. It is important to follow up with all stakeholders involved regarding all of these criteria and their opinions on the new changes being implemented. Based on their responses to these criteria, it can then be determined whether the change was a success or whether the policy once again needs further analysis.